When I look at some of my favorite entries in the Call of Duty series and ones that really stuck with me over the years, I immediately think of games like World at War, Call of Duty 4, Modern Warfare 2, or the game that we're actually going to discuss today, Call of Duty Black Ops. This is another game that's incredibly special to me personally, as it's one that I've spent countless hours playing the multiplayer of and is more than likely my most played entry because of that fact. Admittedly, it's also one that I've played through the campaign multiple times as well, putting it up there with the likes of Modern Warfare 2 for me. When it comes to which ones I prefer, honestly, it's hard to say. I find both Modern Warfare 2 and Black Ops to be great, which is why I want to do the latter justice by going over it today. So with that out of the way, let's get into Call of Duty Black Ops. Call of Duty Black Ops is a game developed by Treyarch and published by Activision. The game itself would be announced on April 30th, 2010, with the game being set during the 1960s Cold War era, a first in the series. Black Ops would go on to release on November 9th, 2010 for Windows, PlayStation 3, the 360, and the Nintendo Wii, with an eventual port to OS X on September 27th of 2012. The game would also have a Nintendo DS version as well, which would act as more of a tie-in to the Black Ops campaign with different characters that supplemented the story. Additionally, there would also be a mobile version of the game that was developed by Glue Mobile as well. This version would be a side-scroller set in the Vietnam War and have an entirely different story and characters. Black Ops would historically be received quite well, with solid scores from both critics and fans alike. However, some would actually criticize the campaign's short length. This wouldn't stop the game from becoming a commercial success, as the game would sell more copies than the previous year's entry, Modern Warfare 2, within the game's first 24 hours. At the time, this would be a record, as Black Ops would have the largest entertainment launch, blowing away some of the highest earning films. Call of Duty Black Ops would go on to be one of the best-selling video games ever, with the game having sold more than 30 million copies. In the same vein as other Call of Duty entries, Black Ops would also have a number of different special editions as well. Beginning with the Hardened Edition, this came with a limited edition Black Ops Collector's Medal, a steelbook case, and 4 extra co-op maps that weren't included in the standard edition of the game. Lastly, the PlayStation and Xbox 360 versions would also include a Woods costume for either PlayStation Home or the Xbox avatars. The Hardened Edition would initially be priced at $79.99. And then finally, we have the Prestige Edition. This thing would include everything in the Hardened Edition, but also include an RC video surveillance vehicle that had the design of an RC XD killstreak within the game, and a transmitter that was able to receive video from the car. This version would cost $149.99. In addition to the game's multiplayer, which I won't be going into in this video, Call of Duty Black Ops also offered a return of the Zombies mode from World at War. If you're unfamiliar with this mode, it's basically either a solo or online co-op mode where you're killing waves of zombies, building up defenses, barricading openings, and purchasing upgrades in order to survive long enough to complete random mini objectives around the map. Not a lot to say, though there was also a few map pack DLCs that were available for purchase that added new areas for Zombies mode, along with the usual multiplayer maps. What I'll also say is that it's still pretty impressive that there's people who continue to play the original Black Ops Zombie mode to this day, which is cool to see. Outside of that, you also had Dead Ops Arcade, which could be accessed by breaking out of the bindings on the main menu and then accessing a computer where you write DOA. As for what Dead Ops Arcade is, it's a top-down game mode where you're dropping zombies while trying to survive through rounds. You could get upgrades and money and stuff by picking up drops that spawn around the area. It's a neat little thing to do, and honestly, the soundtrack to it is pretty awesome too. So with everything out of the way, it's time for my campaign recap. Like always, skip ahead if you don't want to be bothered with this part or just don't care to hear about it. Call of Duty Black Ops begins with our main protagonist, Alex Mason, being grilled by an anonymous interrogator. This leads to Mason being asked about what a series of numbers mean, numbers that we could actually hear, and where they're broadcasted from, as well as a person of interest named Dragovich. The interrogator then asks Mason about previous events, which leads us to the beginning, Cuba 1961, Bay of Pigs. During the following sequence, we learn that Mason went into Cuba with 2 others with the intent of taking down Fidel Castro. The level here begins with the trio of of Mason, Bowman, and Woods inside of a bar meeting a contact who gives them the location of Fidel Castro. Not long after, some soldiers come in and cause a ruckus, which leads to them being dropped. After this, the group gears up and goes out into the streets of Cuba, fighting to a car where they make an escape by ramming through some roadblocks when the screen goes white to Mason being told by the interrogator that he was able to escape the police and headed to Castro's compound. This leads to another time jump where we see Mason, Bowman, and Woods on the outskirts of the compound waiting for a signal from a group attacking an airfield, which leads to this moment where some hardcore music starts playing to get us all pumped up.
La invasión empezó. La pista de aterrizaje está bajo ataque. Tenemos hombres en camino. Aguanten en la posición hasta que llegue el refuerzo. Repito.
With enemy attention diverted, they go on to search the compound, eventually coming across a bedroom where Castro's holed up. Castro and his human shield are killed here, which leads to them rushing off to the airfield under heavy fire. The group then gets to a plane in order to evacuate, but they discover that the runway is blocked by vehicles. This leads to Mason jumping off to a ZPU to clear the vehicles. Mason is then pulled off the gun and knocked out. When he comes to, we find out that they actually had killed a body double. Castro then gives Mason to a man named Dragovich as a gift of their new relationship. This next scene has Mason telling the interrogator that the whole thing was a setup and that he was sent to a Russian labor camp called Vorkuta. We also learn here that Mason was assisted by a man named Viktor Reznov in escaping the camp, which leads to this.
You hit like a child! Hey, сволочь! Всегда ты, Резнов!
Reznov.
Mason, every journey begins with a single step.
This is step one! Secure the keys! Now, we take Vorkuta!
This scene leads to prisoners of Vorkuta rioting as their plan goes forward with their first step of securing keys. Mason goes on, seeing this big dude Sergey manhandling some dudes, and then heads to an elevator with Reznov where another guy questions if they could trust Mason.
Reznov, you sure can trust us, America?
With my life. He and us are not so different. We are all soldiers without an army, betrayed, forgotten, abandoned. In Vorkuta, we are all brothers.
Anyways, after this, the prisoners head outside, causing all sorts of chaos before Mason goes on to use a slingshot to blow up some towers. Shortly after, Mason regroups with Reznov and continues on with the plan, where he's now tasked with launching a harpoon at a helicopter that inevitably causes it to go boom. Once this is finished, Mason heads to an armory where Sergey is killed after being shot while a door closes on him. Mason opens the door and then arms up with a Gatling gun as the prisoners continue their onslaught. Eventually, the soldiers use tear gas, which causes Mason to get messed up. We then get a brief scene with Mason saying that Reznov never left him when we continue back to the retelling of the events of Vorkuta with Reznov and Mason getting on motorcycles and then making their escape. Mason and Reznov eventually take over a truck, driving away, creating more chaos. Shortly after, Reznov tells Mason to jump to a nearby train, which ends the level, having Mason get away with Reznov's status being left in question. After this, Mason says that this was the last that he saw Reznov for a while. From here, the interrogator says that Mason was assigned to Jason Hudson at the CIA and asks how they knew Mason wasn't compromised. Mason says that he was tested and didn't break then and wouldn't break now. The interrogator then follows this up by saying that the government wanted Mason to kill Dragovich. Mason says that there were also others who he was supposed to kill, but when asked who, the next level starts with Mason being summoned to the Pentagon with Hudson, where we see this scene with Secretary McNamara.
Secretary McNamara?
Your reputation precedes you, sir.
Step on it.
Nothing less than our national security is at stake. He has no fear, no conscience, no weakness. This is Nikita Dragovich. I believe you two have already met.
When do I kill him?
We're lucky to have you back, Mason.
As you can see, Mason is tasked with killing Dragovich, and then we see Mason and company going deep into the Pentagon. Mason explains along the way that he kept hearing numbers that he couldn't get out of his head. This leads to Mason being taken to another room where he learns why he's there.
Agent Mason.
Great honor, Mr. President.
Sit. We are in grave danger from the communists. Our freedom, our very way of life is at risk. Dragovich. I'm told that you are the very best that we have. Anywhere. You will need to be. Mr. Mason, take care of it.
This moment's a little strange. Mason starts tripping out a bit, pointing a gun at President Kennedy, but snaps to where he's told to take care of Dragovich, thus ending this section. The following scene is where we see Mason was being sent in to sabotage the Soviets' long-range missile program. This leads to Mason being reunited with Woods and Bowman, along with an introduction to a new character named Grigory Weaver at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in the USSR. The level begins with Mason and Woods together, seeing that the base has heavy activity. Mason uses some binoculars, discovering that there's a Soviet missile being ready for launch, and then goes on to scope the place out, finding a compromised Weaver and Dragovich a second in command, Kravchenko, who stabs Weaver's eye out. Mason and Woods head into the base in order to rescue Weaver by taking down some guards and stealing their uniforms. They eventually regroup with Bowman and some other dude, and then head into a comms building to shut down comms, and then head to the roof, ziplining to a bunker to rescue Weaver. We then see some urgency to abort the Soviet launch, where Weaver tells them that in order to do so, they need to head to an auxiliary control bunker. We then get a cut back to Mason being interrogated, where we see that Mason was tasked with locating an Ascension group and to kill the scientists. However, Mason says that he's to kill Dragovich here. The next part has a group heading into another section where Mason blows up a wall, killing everyone inside. Weaver then goes in trying to stop the launch, but is unable to do so. This leads to Plan B, where Mason uses a rocket to blow up Soyuz 2. With havoc now happening all around, they head into some tunnels to find and kill Dragovich. However, we learn from Mason that Kravchenko was able to escape before they could get to him. Mason goes on to say that they were able to find his limo, but were unable to confirm the kill. Following this scene, we learn that Mason became obsessed with tracking down Dragovich. The interrogator goes on to say that they want the numbers, and we learn here that Mason and Hudson had also been sent to Vietnam to investigate Soviet involvement afterwards in 1968 as a part of a SOG unit led by Frank Woods. The next mission takes place in Quezon, where we meet up with Woods, who explains the situation happening here before chaos happens with their Jeep flipping over and an imminent attack occurring, where we see Woods and Mason drag Hudson to a bunker. We learn here that Mason and Hudson were supposed to get to Hue City, but instead chose to defend Quezon. This leads to Mason eventually having to blow up some tanks, and then another part where he assists in helping push back NVA soldiers by dropping some napalm barrels. Mason eventually makes it to another area with the group where we see this scene with Woods gun jamming and Mason having to drop a soldier. After this, they get to a Jeep and then destroy some more tanks with a tow missile launcher. Once all this is done, we see Bowman drop down from a helicopter, which prompts Hudson to ask about a defector. However, Bowman and Woods just kind of walk away, ignoring him. This leads to a scene talking about the Tet Offensive being the point where America started to lose the war, and that Mason would establish contact with a Russian defector who had intel on Dragovich within a MACV compound in Hue City. We learn here that the city had been overrun by NVA and the defector was most likely dead, but Mason still needed the dossier. To start at Hue City, we see Mason and Woods crashing into a building after their helicopter shot down. Woods takes out a soldier and drops some dudes, giving Mason a shotgun, and the two go on through the building to a safe room. They find out the room had been breached and that the contact may have fallen back to command. The group moves on from here, where Mason eventually goes into a room where he's attacked by an NVA soldier. However, Viktor Reznov actually appears and helps him. Reznov gives Mason the dossier and tells him that Dragovich is planning an attack on the west. This leads to Mason and Reznov heading out of the building and regrouping with Woods as they head to an LZ with the assistance of a chopper to take out targets. This eventually leads to Mason and Woods avoiding near death by tank by managing to push their way into a building. Shortly after this, we see a small scene with Mason in disbelief that Reznov had been the defector and that he had come back for him. The next part has Mason and Reznov moving to take out a ZSU by blowing out a floor with explosives. After this, they regroup to a rally point, defending against NVA while waiting for an evac. Eventually, Mason is tasked with marking a target for fuel air bomb support, which leads to the group getting to a boat to avoid being blown up with a big ol' boom. This level ends with Reznov saying that the enemy's newfound courage could have been the result of them having a new ally. The next scene has the interrogator saying that with the dossier, they were able to ID all of Dragovich's men. This includes Kravchenko, Steiner, and Clark, who were all masterminds of Nova 6. We learn here that Hudson was sent to Kowloon to interrogate Dr. Clark, which leads to this lovely scene here.
Don't you morons get it? If you think your government-sponsored brutality intimidates me, you clearly don't know anything about Dragovich. I have nothing to gain by talking to you.
Think about what you have to lose.
We can do this all day. We got plenty of windows.
Or you can give us what we want and we guarantee your safety.
I'm already a dead man. I've been hunted across every corner of the globe. And if you found me, so will they. They know everything you know. They're probably on their way now.
Why?
Dragovich doesn't like loose ends. I've never even dealt with him directly. Only Steiner, the German.
What was the nature of your business?
I was hired to help stabilize certain volatile compounds.
What kind of compound?
Nova 6. A biochemical weapon.
You led them right to me!
So after this, we learn that Clark was hired to help stabilize Nova 6 as the place gets attacked, leading Weaver, Clark, and Hudson to have to escape the Spetsnaz, eventually jumping down from a rooftop to another building where they stock up on weapons. Continuing from here, we eventually learn from Clark that they'll be able to find Steiner and Yamato, and that the numbers are the key to Dragovich's plan. Under more heavy fire, they eventually make another leap of faith. However, this ends up happening.
I'm slipping! I got you! Легко!
What about the numbers, Clark?
Держи в поле зрения! Над нам! Скоро его не будет! Это key! Сделаю!
So as you could see, Clark gets killed before they can learn what the numbers mean, which leads to Weaver and Hudson heading down the rooftops to extract via a van that comes out of nowhere. We learn here that their next goal is to get to Mount Yamato to find Steiner. Before we could get anywhere with this, however, we get another scene with Mason saying that Kravchenko tested Nova 6 in Vietnam. After this, we learn about Dragovich, Kravchenko, and Steiner from Reznov.
My father was a musician in Stalingrad. During the German occupation, the sound of his violin filled the air with magnificent music. Korsakov, Stasov, many of the great nationalist composers. To my countrymen, it was a symbol of hope. To the Germans, it was a symbol of defiance. Even now, his music still haunts me. The Nazis slit his throat while he slept. Collaborating with any Nazi is a betrayal against all of Mother Russia. Dragovich, Kravchenko were not troubled by such matters. They look only to advance their own interests and agendas.
This next mission, we play as Reznov, who regroups to a vehicle with Dmitry Petrenko. This is where we see Dragovich and Kravchenko, who we find out are there for Dr. Steiner, who had agreed to help them. Reznov then gets on the back of the vehicle and then heads off with the men. We learn here that Dragovich and Kravchenko had left Reznov and his men outnumbered in Stalingrad when the German occupation had begun, and that they weren't to be trusted. We then get this cut back to Reznov, talking about how Petrenko, who he says is the bravest man he's ever known, and him fought at Stalingrad. The next part has the group fighting through the camp, searching for Steiner. Reznov eventually finds him and then is told to take him to Dragovich. This leads back to Reznov essentially saying that he didn't trust Steiner. However, he was still a soldier and believed in following orders. This leads to another time jump with the group heading into a ship which is supposed to contain something of importance. At this moment, we learn about something called the Giftdigger Sturm project, which involved the development of chemical weapons, one of which, Nova 6, had actually been stored on the ship. However, the ship had been destroyed by British soldiers, which led to Germans attempting to salvage it, but by the time they were able to, Germany had surrendered Berlin. This leads to another scene where Reznov says that they had found Nova 6, but he and his men were betrayed by Dragovich, who ends up testing the gas on his men. As Reznov watches them die, we learn that Western allies had also been looking for the weapons as well, which leads to the ship being attacked by British soldiers. Reznov and his remaining men fight their way to arm explosives in order to destroy Nova 6. After this, they escape the ship as it blows up. However, he learned at Vorkuta that this didn't stop Dragovich from giving up on the weapon, which leads to another scene with Reznov and Mason.
Mason, listen to me. We are running out of time, my friend. Can you trust your leaders to destroy it? Or do you think they will use it? The flag may be different, but the methods are the same. They will use you as they used me. You must decide. Decide what you think is worth fighting for. Dragovich, Kravchenko, Steiner. These men must die.
So with this scene, we essentially see Reznov saying that Mason would be used in the same way that he was, and basically that the United States government would also use Nova 6, ending here that Dragovich, Kravchenko, and Steiner need to die. After this scene ends, it's followed by one with the interrogator talking about how Hudson's mission in Kowloon had been a success since it allowed them to learn about Nova 6. After this, the interrogator asks Mason if Reznov was with him in Vietnam. This is where we learn that he was, along with Kravchenko as well. The next mission begins with a mayday call as the level begins on a downed helicopter that gets attacked by the NVA. Mason and Woods escape the helicopter with the assistance of Reznov after it sinks into some water. Surviving the endeavor, Mason heads up the river with Woods to rendezvous with Whiskey Team at a rally point. After getting to the location, Mason explains that there's a nearby outpost under the command of General Kravchenko. Mason and Woods then split off from Whiskey Team to then go plant some explosives, which they eventually detonate after reaching a village. Under fire, Mason blows up a ZPU along the river, which allows helicopters to move in on the village. After this, they go and clear the village, which leads to Mason having to go into a rat tunnel along with someone named Swift. Along the way, Mason finds Reznov, which prompts Swift to question what's going on with Mason. This leads to Swift being killed by a soldier who comes out of nowhere. Not long after this, Mason regroups with Reznov, who tells him that there's signs of Soviets in the tunnels. They go on, eventually finding Kravchenko's compound, which had been abandoned. Mason then tells Reznov to grab some documents, and then the two go to escape, finding that the place had been rigged with explosives. This leads to Mason having to dig his way out of a collapsing tunnel, eventually getting to a cliffside where he jumps to a helicopter, thus ending the level. The next scene, we learn from the interrogator that they were able to confirm Kravchenko's presence in Vietnam. He also says that Reznov can't be trusted either. Mason, however, says that Reznov is the reason that they found Clark in Nova 6. Mason starts hearing numbers again, with the interrogator saying that he had been brainwashed. This goes on to another scene where we learn that Kravchenko had been spraying nerve gas across Vietnam, and that Hudson had told Mason that the CIA had downed a Soviet cargo plane that had been carrying Nova 6 in Laos. This leads to the next level, where Mason and the SOG team are tasked with traveling up the Mekong River via boat to retrieve Nova 6 from the wreckage. The next part is pretty much just driving a boat, blowing stuff up. Along the way, a Marine tagging along with the crew gets killed, which leads to a brief scene with Mason showing a little sympathy. After this, we get a small time jump forward as Mason drives a boat to a shore and then continues on with the group to a downed plane. Heading inside, they find that Nova 6 dispersed after it crashed and that all of it was gone. Right after this, Bowman finds a map of the area with the location of Kravchenko's compound in Laos. Afterwards, they head further into the plane to defend the crash site. However, the site is eventually shot down, which leads to Mason, Woods, and Bowman falling with the wreckage and getting captured by Spetsnaz soldiers. Before this section ends, we see Drogovich and Kravchenko come out of nowhere and knock out Mason. The next scene shows that Mason was captured by Dragovich and that his unit had gone MIA with the presumption that they were dead. This led to Hudson to search for Nova 6 in Mount Yamato without Mason. We learn here that this is where Hudson learned about the numbers as well. This next part leads to a little scene with a Blackbird taking off with a section where we're playing as a Captain Mosley. So basically, during this part of the mission, we're tasked with directing Hudson's team to some barracks to blow up enemy comms, and then afterwards, north, where we hear Mosley tell Hudson that there's nearby infantry. We find out with a brief transition that Hudson led an attack on Yamato before we switch back to Hudson and team hiding from a group of soldiers who pass by. This leads to them rappelling down to take a substation and then go out to knock out external comms by disabling a relay. From here, we see this section where a walkway gets blown up with an RPG and this dude Harris falls to his death. After this, an avalanche occurs where we see the remaining team jump off, deploying parachutes where they land at another section of the base to search for Steiner. Unfortunately, all they find is that the area is rigged to blow. We learn here that Dragovich has sleeper cells across the United States waiting to be signaled to release Nova 6. Steiner says here that he's at Rebirth Island and is the only one who could help them stop the numbers broadcast. With the place ready to blow, Hudson and crew fight their way out as Spetsnaz overruns the area. Towards the end, we see an avalanche come down on the base, which Weaver and Hudson narrowingly escape. This is followed by a scene with the interrogator saying that the communists were waiting for the right moment to strike with sleeper cells that are activated with numbers that Mason should be able to translate. Mason goes on saying that Dragovich had them trapped like rats in cages, which leads to Bowman being killed, and then this.
This time, do it. Aim line. Ready.
Play.
6 and 8 o'clock.
Hell yeah, I'm through!
So summarizing this scene, Woods and Mason are able to surprise their captors and find a way to escape. However, they realize that the Russian who was with the other soldiers was able to avoid getting dropped here, though it doesn't really matter in the end because they're able to find and kill him before he could make his way out. After this, Mason and Woods go on to steal Hind, using it to blow stuff up as they head to Kravchenko's compound. Once there, Woods and Mason end up freeing some captured prisoners, one of which just so happens to be Reznov. Reznov tells Mason that Kravchenko's in the compound, eventually crossing him.
Not this time, American. You again. I should have killed you in Vorkuta. Gotcha now, you son of a bitch. You dying with me. What?
So right here, Woods stabs Kravchenko. However, in a last-ditch effort, Kravchenko pulls pins from some grenades on his chest before Woods jumps out of a nearby window with him, sacrificing himself to make sure that Mason isn't caught in the blast. But upon coming to, Mason sees a figure of Woods that appears to be Reznov in the end, who tells him that Kravchenko's dead. This scene ends with the interrogator asking where the number station is. Afterwards, we learn that the entire SOG team, including Woods and Bowman, had been killed with Mason being the only survivor. We learn after this, Mason went rogue, continuing to Rebirth Island to kill Steiner. We also learn here that Hudson and his team had gone to the island as well, and that Mason did in fact kill Steiner in the end. The interrogator goes on from here explaining that Nova 6 had been weaponized, and that Dragovich's sleeper cells are on US soil. However, Mason had gone dark, which now has the US preparing a preemptive strike to stop the attack. Mason says here that Steiner had to die, and then the next level begins with Mason and Reznov sneaking into Rebirth Island. Along the way, we see that the CIA had begun their attack as well. This leads to Mason infiltrating the Soviet lab and eventually encountering Steiner.
Dragovich's men are rounding up everyone on the island! Those no longer essential to his plans are being executed! You must hurry before they kill me too!
Friedrich Steiner. This is the end.
I know you. Vorkuta. You don't know what we did to you.
Mason, talk to me.
Your evil has claimed the lives of many good men. No longer.
Killing me will not stop Nova. I do not care about Nova. My name is Victor Reznov. And I will have my revenge!
So from the perspective of Mason here, we see that Reznov kills Steiner. However, we get a flash to the interrogator explaining that it was actually Mason who did the deed. This leads us to switch into Hudson's point of view with the attack on Rebirth Island along with Weaver. So to begin, we get this section where we're manning a turret, blowing stuff up before a helicopter causes Hudson to get knocked out of the vehicle before Nova 6 is dispersed. While navigating the Nova 6 infested area, Hudson eventually gets to the biolab where him and Weaver find Steiner.
Mason! We have to stop him now!
Damn, it's bulletproof! Mason, what are you doing? We need him alive! Stand down! Stand down!
My name is Victor Reznov, and I will have my
Revenge! Mason, no!
So we learn here that Mason was actually the one who killed Steiner and that Reznov was never there at all. So with Steiner now dead, their final effort to find the broadcast station is through Mason, since he's their last link. The next scene, we overhear Reznov basically explaining that the only reason he's still alive is to get revenge against Dragovich, Kravchenko, and Steiner. After this, we're back in the interrogation room where we see that there's now two people talking amongst each other, one of which says that the location of the number station is somewhere in Mason's head. We hear the interrogator say that he's got one more card to play when we find out that it's been Hudson the whole time talking to Mason, with Weaver being the other guy. Hudson tells Mason that Reznov's dead and that they're out of time. Hudson releases Mason, who punches and knocks him out, which leads to Mason tripping out, hearing numbers and having a bunch of flashbacks. This leads to Mason finding out that he was programmed to translate the numbers while in Vorkuta. He then goes on seeing a bunch of scenes with Reznov before going on, having some more flashbacks before Hudson pops out of nowhere.
The pain is difficult, isn't it? We are brothers, Mason. We are the same. Dragovich, Kravchenko, Steiner, all must die.
Dragovich brainwashed you, but Reznov had plans of his own.
Mason.
Reznov, how'd you get out of Vorkuta? Never thought I'd see you alive.
He was never in Vietnam. The real defector with the Nova 6 dossier died during the attack on the MacV. He was never in the rat tunnels.
So yeah, we learned here that Reznov never actually made it out of Vorkuta. However, he was able to sabotage Dragovich's attempt at brainwashing Mason into killing JFK, instead causing him to want to kill Steiner, Kravchenko, and Dragovich. Hudson says here that the Nova 6 attack on the United States is imminent, and only Mason is able to tell them what the numbers mean. Hearing the numbers again, Mason is finally able to discern that all broadcasting instructions had come from the ship the Rusalka in Cuba, which is our next destination. The next level begins with us joined by Hudson on the attack, thinning enemy defenses via helicopter before their chopper gets shot down while attempting to land. Surviving the event, they head on into the Rusalka, eventually finding out that the numbers are being broadcast from a station underwater. Hudson then confirms the location for a bombing run. However, Mason says that they need to kill Dragovich. This leads to Hudson and Mason heading underwater to the number station. After infiltrating the location, we see the place is getting bombarded, which leads to Mason and Hudson coming across the broadcast area and Dragovich. Mason drowns Dragovich here, and then him and Hudson make their escape as the station's flooded. We then see Hudson and Mason swimming to the surface where we get a nice, satisfying end.
Mason! It is over. We won.
For now.
However, this is followed by one last scene of a numbers broadcast station.
2, 3, 19, 0, 8, 11, 22, 21, 5, 17, 17, 0, 10, 2, 23, 1, 8, 11, 25, 22, 9, 4,
6.5 millimeter.
9, 23, 1, 12, 0, 12, 16,
11, 22.
6, 12, 8, 4, 1, 6, 2, 10, 2, 1.
Texas. Ascension.
So if it's hard to tell, we have this ambiguous scene of Mason near JFK around the time of his assassination, and then the game ends. And that, my friends, is Call of Duty Black Ops. Summarizing my thoughts on the campaign of Call of Duty Black Ops, I have to say, it's still a phenomenal experience. There's so many random details in the game that you might not catch at first glance. I went through Black Ops a couple times for this video, and I swear, I didn't notice that during some sections, most notably the ones where Reznov appears, you can hear numbers being said. It's a subtle touch, and I think this is something that might be easy for someone to miss, or maybe not even think about while it's happening. What I'll also add is that Black Ops has just as many epic moments and likable characters as MW2 as well, but what I will say is the biggest positive is that the game's story really strays away from the usual military stuff that we'd seen from previous entries and embraces the Cold War period of history, which is still pretty fascinating, and going into the game's sleeper agent brainwashing stuff, since there tends to be a lot of conspiracy theories revolving around this era as well. There's also this little shot of Mason at the end with the implication that he may have had a hand in the assassination of JFK too. When you first see this, it's like, bro, what? It's an interesting twist, and one that has led to people speculating if this was the case within the game's lore, though it's something that was never really confirmed, just sort of referenced in one little scene near the end of the game.
Tried to make me kill my own president!
Pride?
Either way, there's so much that you could handpick with the campaign of Black Ops that really makes it stand out in the Call of Duty franchise, and that's something that I could still applaud for at least attempting to differ itself from other entries. It's a great game and still really fun to play too. Now, going on into the game further and talking about the gameplay, it's nothing that's gonna blow anyone away if they expect to be doing anything different from the other campaigns. What can you really say? It's a first-person shooter, but what I will add is that the game is quite gory. Seriously, this is another campaign where you can blow off limbs and cause an absolute mess with bloodshed. It's a brutal game, and honestly, I love every bit of it. This isn't something new with Treyarch titles either, as Call of Duty World at War also had a lot of gore as well. But I could personally say that coming fresh off of something like Call of Duty Ghosts, I was a little bit surprised at how much more brutal this game was. But anyways, as for the types of stuff we do in Black Ops, I don't think that there's anything that stands out too much, except for maybe a few levels where you go around flying in a helicopter, blowing stuff up, or this other one where you have to direct a team to either avoid or take out enemies while you're overlooking their movement in a Blackbird. I've always viewed sorts of things like these as something to break up the usual level monotony, though the Blackbird mission is kinda eh. It's not my favorite thing, but hey, you never know if someone might find this to be like the greatest mission ever. But for me, it's whatever. Though I can at least say that there's plenty of other stuff about the game that I like with the story and whatnot, since the game itself is filled with plenty of action-packed moments. I'd also say that Black Ops has some of my favorite guns in the series too. If you see my Ghost video, you probably already know that I tend to have more fun sniping in these games, but with Black Ops, you have so much cool stuff to play around with. The game also has one of the coolest shotguns in the series, thanks to these Dragon Breath rounds. Not only do they look awesome, but it also feels satisfying to shred enemies with this thing. This is probably my favorite aspect of any of the weaponry in the campaign, and honestly, it makes running and gunning feel pretty damn awesome too. Everything else is pretty typical, though you do have the ability to dual wield weapons in the game too. Black Ops also does a really good job at making you feel like a real bad dude in the same sense as something like Doom, thanks to how beastly some of the guns feel. Like I mentioned before, the game is pretty damn gory. It makes using things like these explosive crossbow bolts feel even more satisfying to use, and that's really the key thing here. Whether it be something like an LMG, a shotgun, the flamethrower attachment, or the explosive crossbow, the game is so fun to drop enemies that it doesn't really feel like it ever gets boring. I'll also say that Treyarch nailed the Cold War stuff down too. It's honestly a realm that I don't think I had much familiarity with outside of film. I mean, how many old movies out there exist where we've seen how brutal it was with Vietnam and stuff like PTSD? But the thing with Black Ops is that around this time, there was more of a focus on more modern-based combat with things like Battlefield and even the shift of Call of Duty moving from releasing mostly World War II shooters to the Modern Warfare series. That being said, I really think that Treyarch did a great job with their loose retelling of Cold War events by creating levels that really help the game feel more cinematic with its atmosphere. I mean, come on, we have one level where we're sabotaging a Russian rocket by blowing it out of the sky, and another where we're supposed to be assassinating Fidel Castro. There's so many crazy events in the game that really reinforce the extent of how much insane stuff happened behind the scenes during the game's time period. What I'd also add is that Black Ops has some of my favorite voice acting in the series as well. I always like Frank Wood's character as well as Victor Reznov. The latter, honestly, having so many random quotable moments in the game too. I also think Sam Worthington and Ice Cube deliver a lot of great moments with their performances of Mason and Bowman as well. I'd also add that the trio of Mason, Bowman, and Woods are just as likable as members of Task Force 141 from MW2 in the sense that they feel like an awesome squad thanks to the game's writing and so many epic moments that happen right out of the gates. Lastly, I'd also say that Black Ops has a really great soundtrack too. I mentioned Cuba's Streets in my recap, which plays in Operation 40. This track honestly goes hard and really just sort of plays unexpectedly, setting the tone and the mood of the stage. But there's other tracks that provide a lot of build-up too. Rooftops, for example, has a slow build-up as you progress through the level, and when that midway point of the track kicks in, it's like, damn, you're ready to mess stuff up. Same goes for stuff like the Hue City Defector track, which is metal and makes going through the level feel hardcore. Honestly, the brutality of Black Ops and combination with the soundtrack make you feel like it may as well be Doom minus the demons. So finally, one last thing to go over, and that is what kind of flaws does Black Ops actually have? Well, this one could just be me, but I noticed a few areas where the lighting was a bit wonky. I played the PC version and specifically had an issue where you come across Reznov in some tunnels. I don't know what was up with this one, but it looked really weird. No idea how to fix this one, though I'm sure it's possible. I just didn't know what I was doing. I'd also say that the game's short length might bother some people too. Game length tends to be a complaint that I've seen more and more people bring up recently, and after doing a quick search, I saw that Black Ops average length, according to howlongtobeat.com, was like 7 hours. But honestly, it probably took me a little less than 5 playing the game on regular difficulty. That being said, I did have fun replaying the game still, so I'd say that the replay value counts here at least. And having extra stuff like zombies helps add more value to game time if you could get into that. But anyways, that's all I had to say here. So in closing, Call of Duty Black Ops is still a fantastic game. It's easily one of my favorites in the series, and honestly, is up there with some of my favorite first-person shooters as well. The time period that the game is set in is something that I don't think is oversaturated by any means, so that helps it stand out to this day as well. I also give credit where it's due. Treyarch did a phenomenal job at making the game feel epic. Black Ops has a lot of moments that I'd place up there with some of my favorites from Modern Warfare 2. It really helps that the game itself has a lot of great characters who help the story and events flow in a way that meshes into a game that really feels like a blockbuster hit. The game's soundtrack is also a highlight that I don't think will ever get old either. There's so many hardcore tracks that help make you feel like a real bad MF playing the game. It's awesome, and one that I would highly recommend thanks to an interesting campaign and some of the coolest missions in the series. Thank you all for watching. It was fun to go back and work on something for Black Ops since this is another one of my favorites. If you've made it this far, please consider liking and subscribing. I also want to give a big thank you to everyone for helping me hit 1K subscribers. It really means a lot to see the positive reactions, and I'm super grateful for everything. We'll be back with more soon enough, so stay tuned. Until next time, peace out.